delighted to say that our next guest, Valkerie Baynes, has the onerous task of explaining what has happened in the Women's Ashes down under. ESPNCricinfo's women's cricket writer. Val, Australia are 12-0 up going into the Test match. It's a disaster, and you didn't see this coming. I don't think anybody did they?
No, not at all. I hold my hands up. But the last time we spoke, I said I was really interested to see just how close this was going to be, implying that it was going to be close. That was probably based largely on the last Ashes campaign here in England, where they drew 8-all. And I expected a lot more from this England side and for it to be a lot closer. There was talk about Australia having been stung by that result, I guess, and the caution that they were going to come back stronger than ever. They certainly have, but I don't know that anyone sort of saw that it was going to be quite this much of a wipeout.
Well, there's been a lot of talk about, I think, about a lot of external stuff, and having been part of a 4-1 and a 5-0 Ashes defeat out in Australia, it is a difficult place to go and play. And especially when you just mentioned there, Australia had their backs up. They were ready for England off the back of that 8-all draw in the last Ashes. Is it too simple to say that Australia is just so much better than England and their players are so much better than England rather than looking for outside stuff? Or is it, have England been really that bad?
In this instance, Australia have just been so good, so much better. I think what you raise is really interesting in terms of home ground advantage, and there's better than anyone what it's like playing sort of at home and away, and there was talk about that being a factor. England were very aware that going over there was going to be hard, playing Australia in their own house. And I guess you could argue, Australia found it hard being over here in England last Ashes series. However, I mean, if that was so much of a factor all the time, teams wouldn't get rolled at home ever. So there's got to be that taken into consideration. You are playing away, and I just don't think playing away can explain the gulf between these two sides.
Val, I don't want to open myself up to ridicule and walk down the Jon Lewis path, he said that he went for a walk one evening from Bondi to Coogee Beach, and everybody was in the water, and everybody was, fit and healthy, and that lends itself to a more conducive sporting environment. And he sounded a bit like a nutter, but I do kind of understand what he's saying. I mean, it would be easier to live that life than to go to an indoor school in the middle of February in Nottingham.
Yeah, sure. But again, I don't know that can explain the gulf between these two sides. They were close here in England last time they met, and so you can't sort of put that down to differences in lifestyle, because that hasn't changed in the last 18 months. We know, there are differences in sporting cultures, I guess, between the two countries, but there's also, talk of that gap, or has been talk of that gap closing, the professionalization of the women's game over here, the restructure and that sort of thing. And that was seen to be basically an answer to Australia forging so much further ahead. And that came about after the 2019 Ashes series here, when England lost 12-4. There was ultimately this restructure of the game over here on the premise that, they were going to catch up to Australia. So that happened. We've seen great leaps happen in the women's game over here, but, just not to the extent that they're going to beat Australia at home, evidently, on the basis of this series. I don't think we can put down improvements in the game being stymied by, an inherent difference in climate and culture and upbringing.
Val, Manners knows that I'm very, very good at putting my foot in it when this mouth opens. So I'm going to probably do it again here when I've listened to the Jon Lewis stuff, and the culture is different in Australia, but it's not been that different for the last 125 years we've been playing cricket, both home and away. And I mean, Jon Lewis lived in Brighton, so he understands in the middle of English summer, there's a lot of people in the sea in the middle of the English summer. I've seen a lot of the games, but I've not seen all of it. And I just wonder if, the way the women's game's gone, the trajectory it's gone, especially in England, that we've been given more professional contracts. You know, the players have been paid more. Everything that goes with it. And I always work with the theory that when you get a young player, whether it's a boy or a girl, once they get that tracksuit, they think they've met it, and they don't work as hard, or they feel as though, right, who are you to talk down to me? Who are you to tell me what to do? And are we in a situation in England that because of the trajectory of the 100, and Manners will tell you, Val, I have spoke so well of the women's game and the 100 and the trajectory it's on. Have we just been a little bit complacent where we've been given these contracts, we're looking at paid the same as the men, and we're looking as though our career paths are going in such a way we are professional. But when you go professional, you have to work as hard, if not harder. And did we see that with the England team?
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, Harmy. And I think, you know, it's hard not being behind closed doors and knowing what those conversations are and whether they are responding to, you know, what they're being told to do or not. But I sort of picked up on a similar theme with Jon Lewis after the last T20 defeat in Adelaide last week. And I asked him, given that 8-8 draw in England last time around, did you go into this series a bit overconfident or with a little too much confidence? He said no. He said it gave us some confidence, but not too much. And I guess you're not going to want to, you know, say, yes, you know, we went up against the Aussies, you know, with too much confidence and what have you. But it was something that had occurred to me. Did they actually think that they were going to be a lot closer than they actually are, given that result last time around? And, you know, I don't know what work went on behind the scenes after that, but I think a lot of it to me has looked like, the mental side of things being the difference here between Australia and England. Australia have come out and, you know, wanting to really make a mark early, and once they had, wanting to grind England into the dust, and they have again, whereas, you know, England haven't sort of shown sort of a mental approach that suggests that, you know, they think that they can beat Australia in Australia.
You know, it does seem as though there's a team believed in their own hype, and I know what it feels like because in 2005 we probably did. Went there in 2007, and within 11 days the series was gone. How do you change that mentality, because it's the same captain, it's the same coach, and more by and large, you know, similar players?
Yeah, I think one thing that stood out for me in that respect is there's been, you know, so much talk since Jon Lewis came in as head coach about how they want to playing this inspire and entertain style and what have you. And that's been spoken about ever since, you know, he came on board. And even early in this series, after the first one day in North Sydney, there was sort of talk about, well, we lost, but we're playing how we want to play. And so, you know, that's okay. I would say if you're playing how you want to play, but it's not working, you've got to make a change. So in terms of, you know, if we're sort of focusing on the mental side of things, after that question I put to Jon Lewis last week about being, you know, confident or overconfident, he said, look, you know, we're just not executing in the moment. And that, again, comes back to mental approach for me. So I think, you know, you have to sort of sit down and say, we need to be able to adapt and change when things aren't going our way, not just stick to our mantra. And I think, you know, he admitted that Australia are, you know, the best at that. You know, they adapt and change and do what they have to do as the situation dictates. And I think that's something that's been lacking for the England side.
Finally, from me, Val, Heather Knight's come under criticism as well, come in for criticism. She did sound a little bit delusional after a couple of the defeats, and she said we weren't that far off. You know, when you lose a T20 game by 30-odd runs, you are quite a long way off. Jon Lewis has insisted that he's the right man for the job. And interestingly, Nat Sciver-Brunt, answering a question, not sort of putting herself forward, she said she would love to captain England. So don't sit on the fence here. Feel free to jump off the fence. Should there be sweeping changes? Is Heather Knight the right person to carry on? Is Jon Lewis the right coach?
I think that in terms of that question put to Nat Sciver-Brunt, I think she answered it in the way that I would expect her to. You know, if she had have come out on, you know, one side saying, yes, I want the job now, or no, I'm not cut out for it, that would be like a massive story. But she has just basically said, I think, what you'd expect her to say as, you know, a vice captain or one of the leadership group. So I think if you're going to ask whether Heather Knight should stay as captain, you've got to look at who would come in instead, and whether they, you know, would be happy with, you know, who they've got waiting in the wings. I mean, you know, Nat Sciver-Brunt says she wants to do the job, and if they decide that that's the way it's going to work, you know, then fine. But yeah, I think they have to look really closely at who they've got to come into that role and as a deputy to Sciver-Brunt. Likewise, you know, with the coaching, it's a case of, you know, do they think that they can get results by persisting and, you know, going on with the current, you know, state of things, but with changes within what they're doing? Or is it a case of, do they need a fresh approach? And, you know, who would they get to come in?
And in 10 seconds, England have got no chance in the test match, have they?
I just instinctively shook my head straight away.
So did we.
Yeah, on the basis of what we've seen, I really don't think so. And I also feel a bit too that if they win the test, you know, what does that say about this campaign overall? Is it like, oh, well, actually, it's not as bad as we thought? Or, you know, is it that, you know, does it paper over the cracks, I guess, is what I'm asking. But on the basis of, you know, how we've seen these two sides play, I think Australia will walk away with the test as well.